Blessings, good evening. Another very peaceful evening. It's Tuesday night, so that means we have some questions to answer. So might as well launch straight into them. First one, Lumpur, I was listening to a Dhamma talk yesterday, and there was a line that said, once you've experienced or tasted the deathless, you'll have complete faith in the Buddha's teachings. I was wondering what the experience of the deathless might be. Is it samadhi? Well, samadhi is part of the Eightfold Path. It's the eighth factor. It's the Eightfold Path that leads to the deathless. Literally, the deathless is nibbana. It's the unconditioned, the unborn, the uncreated. So it's called the deathless, the amata Dhamma. So a taste of the deathless, well, practicing mindfulness regularly, continuously, practicing it well, gives you a taste of the deathless. It's not really the deathless because it's just mindfulness, which is still part of the conditioned realm. It's part of the path or magga that we develop and cultivate. It gives you a taste. So when you practice mindfulness continuously, and then you develop the factors of samadhi, so, initial and sustained application of mind, rapture, happiness, and then one-pointedness. And samadhi is like the continuous presence of mindfulness. So both are very close. But you also need wisdom, right view, right thought, and the other aspects of the path, right effort, right livelihood, right action, for all the path factors to come together in the mind to give one a vision of the deathless, a vision of nibbana. So you could say the Sotapanna, the stream enterer, has had a glimpse of nibbana at the moment they experience the path, the fruit. So the Sotapanna never has any more doubts about the effectiveness of the practice, the possibility of the deathless or the nibbana, because they've had a glimpse of it. But their mind is not completely purified yet. They still have to continue practicing. But they have no more doubt, uncertainty about the path of practice. The fruits of the practice has dropped away. And even though they're not yet fully experiencing nibbana, they have no more doubt in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. They have great enthusiasm for the practice, and they just continue for a maximum of 7 lives, but maybe only 1 life or 3 lives. But we say also, just practically speaking, we sort of say, well, mindfulness is the path to the deathless. So that's that famous phrase from the Dhammapada. It's actually heedfulness is the path to the deathless. Appamado amata padang. Pamado machano padang. So heedlessness or lack of mindfulness is the way to death. So Ajahn Chah used to say, when you're not mindful, it's like your mind dies. It switches off from the Dhamma, from the truth, because you're not mindful. At any moment, when you're not mindful, or for even a few minutes or a while that you're not mindful, it's like your mind just goes to sleep, goes to death. when you re-establish mindfulness, awareness, you're awake again, you're back. So this is why we experience this sort of birth and death throughout our day, throughout our life. Born into this mood, that thought, that perception, and then because of the nature of phenomena, they're impermanent, there's this constant experience of birth and death, arising, passing away. One moment happy, another moment sad. One moment peaceful, one moment disturbed. We're really experiencing birth and death all the time through our day. And when you start to practice the path of mindfulness and heedfulness, it's like that experience of birth and death starts to get less. So you could say it's like the Sotapanna has reached a point where it's just the factors of the path have merged together, and the practice of heedfulness and mindfulness is so established it won't degenerate anymore. But they're not yet perfectly heedful, perfectly mindful. Only the Arahant is. But it's established to the point where they won't stray from the path anymore. It won't degenerate. So Nibbana is assured with a maximum of 7 lives. In the time of the Buddha, that phrase, heedfulness or mindfulness is the path to the deathless, was given, and it's related to that story of the lady Samawati, the queen, and one of King Pasenadi's queens, but she was the subject of another queen, Margandia's jealousy. Margandia had a grudge against Samawati, had a grudge against the Buddha, because when she was young, her parents, out of misguided faith, offered her to the Buddha, and he said, "Why would I accept this woman with her unattractive or foul body?" Because he was just pointing to the unattractive element in the human body. But Margandia was a young woman, so she was obsessed with her own beauty and was very offended and held a grudge against the Buddha for many years to come. And then, because she didn't practice the Dhamma, she was full of hatred and jealousy. And then Samawati, who did have faith in the Buddha and did practice, came along. And so Margandia was always trying to convince the king that Samawati was no good and out to kill him. And eventually she set fire to the female quarters in the palace where Samawati lived and murdered her. But because Samawati was already a noble one, Aryapugala, and her mindfulness was excellent and her practice was well developed, she died mindfully. And this prompted the phrase, one who practices mindfulness doesn't die. They're no longer subject to birth and death. Whereas Margandia, the king, ended up killing her and all her relatives. And he was so angry that she had killed Samawati, who was a very good person, that he, having killed Margandia and all her family and relatives, ploughed the bones of their bodies into the field and completely destroyed them. So the opposite of Samawati. So mindfulness, heedfulness leads to the deathless. Lack of mindfulness or heedlessness leads to death. And we can test that every day in our practice. When you lose your mindfulness, your mind dies from the truth, from awareness, and you're born into the next sankhara, the next condition. Pleasant or unpleasant, the next thought takes over the mind and goes through a cycle. until we re-establish mindfulness and come back to the deathless. So another question. Can Lumpur give some examples of moral and ethical speech and conduct through right action, right speech? Well, right speech is literally speech that is true, not lying, not deceiving, speech that is non-divisive, so not telling tales, gossiping, or setting people against each other by making false claims or accusations, or saying things that are going to make one person angry with another, look down on another. Right speech that is not coarse, so not swearing, abusing, and then right speech that is not idle chatter, useless chatter that leads to a decline in mindfulness. So we're all guilty of wrong speech through our lives. We've all probably told a lie once upon a time, deceived others. Sometimes it's a very small, minor lie. Sometimes it's a more bigger lie with bigger consequences, maybe. We probably all gossip too much, or because we're angry with someone, told someone else about them and tried to turn that person against them, get them on our side and turn them against that person. Often they're linked, aren't they? When you're angry with someone, you'll tell lies about them. But it's also divisive speech. Instead of creating harmony and good conditions for the practice, we split people up and we produce bad feeling. And the Buddha said we use our speech like daggers or arrows to hurt people and set them apart. We can abuse people. We say things to hurt their feelings or swear, be coarse. But probably most common of all is just idle, useless chatter about stuff that doesn't lead to the arising of the path factors, sila, samadhi, panya, mindfulness and wisdom, or heedfulness, speech that just takes our mind to, fills the mind with different moods, useless information, distraction. And you see how a lot of things we talk about don't encourage an increase in our mindfulness, the opposite. So we talk about politics and entertainment and all kinds of stuff, but with not much mindfulness or awareness. And so it just feels, maybe not even talking about politics or entertainments or sports or things like that, but just filling the air with sound. They say, just because we can't bear to be with silence sometimes, people just say anything better than nothing. And so they just kind of keep on talking. You see that in any group of people. So yesterday I was in the school, there's always one child who just can't stop talking. And a lot of what they're saying doesn't make much sense at all, but they like the sound of their own voice and they're so used to it, they just keep on talking. We've all had that in ourselves, and there'll always be people around us who like that, and their words are not that meaningful. The opposite, they're often just filling the airwaves with idle chatter. You hear radio, like when you go into town or something, and you hear what they call talk-back radio, or just different radio stations. Of course, a lot of radio is fine and it's sharing information, but sometimes they're just talking rubbish. They even make money at it, so I guess that encourages them to do it more. Sometimes we talk rubbish. You notice if you're a meditator and you're starting to talk rubbish, you notice after a while, you realize what you're saying just isn't helpful to you, it isn't helpful to anyone. It may not even be true, or it's just meaningless chatter. We all do it. Of course, a lot of speech can be used as it should be, as a way to communicate well, to communicate the Dhamma, to communicate useful things to do with our work, our family, our social life. So it's not all speech is wrong by any means, but we have to learn how to filter our speech. So Ajahn Chah used to say, you don't learn not to just say everything that's on your mind. Some things you say that are helpful, some things you don't. Because a lot of the thoughts that come up in our mind are useless and they don't need to be said out. We just let them go. When we're mindful, we can do that. So we have to filter our speech and reflect on speech. And when you meditate, you're doing that a lot because you're seeing the verbal sankharas arising in your mind and you're considering, is this true, not? Is it helpful or not? Is it kind? Is it rooted in metta, kindness or not? Is it to the point or not? And if you're going to speak something out, you also have to consider time and place. Because sometimes, we say something, we say, well, it's true, so I'm going to say it, but maybe it's the wrong time. Maybe the person who's hearing your speech, they're very stressed, so it's not the right time to tell them the hard truth about their behavior or what they've said or done in the past. Maybe out of compassion you wait for a better time or a better location. Sometimes you don't want to tell people secrets or your secrets or talk about their secrets. So sometimes you have to pick the right location, the right time to speak to someone because it's a private issue or something that other people may misunderstand. So as monks in a monastery, when we have to admonish each other, meaning give each other instruction, advice, feedback, we have to consider these sort of factors before we give admission. Is my mind grounded in metta, or am I going to speak out of anger? Because quite often we want to admonish or tell someone off, give them feedback just because we're angry. So you have to let go of your anger first. You have to only speak about what is true. Because sometimes when we want to criticize or admonish someone else, we go on assumptions, misunderstandings, misperceptions sometimes. Sometimes we drag in things that we've just heard, rumors, heard from other people, but we don't know for sure that it's true. So you try to speak that which is true. You establish mindfulness and you establish goodwill. You pick words that are going to convey the message well, because sometimes words can be misconstrued, or they can be too harsh or too soft or too vague. So the art of communicating, both speaking and listening, is something that takes practice. Nowadays that also applies to texts, emails and things, and emails are the hardest because it's much harder to convey the subtleties of language in emails, and time and place of the person receiving your email. You don't know where they are going to be when they read it and what their state of mind will be, whether it's a really suitable time. And your words may be too blunt or too direct sometimes. So text and written communication has its own challenges, doesn't it? The important thing is to see that right speech is one factor in this Eightfold Path. It's a whole part of the path, so it's not to be neglected. And the Buddha didn't just say, well, never speak at all then, because there's problems with communication, don't speak. He actually made a rule that, for a monastery of monks, we can't all agree just to stop speaking, say for a retreat time. Individual monks sometimes do take on a practice of noble silence, and that's okay if it's agreed to and discussed. But the Buddha said we shouldn't do it as a whole monastery, because it could lead to a lot of misunderstanding, misperceptions and problems. Because if you're not talking to each other, then it's hard to get things done. So there's a lot of work to be done considering what is right speech, training oneself in the skillful intentions that lie behind right speech, and then restraining the unskillful intentions that promote wrong speech, harsh speech, foolish speech, hurtful speech, spiteful speech, and so on. But it links very closely to the practice of mindfulness and meditation, because speech always begins as thinking, verbalizations. So as you become more mindful, you tend to remember, or you're more aware of what you're thinking, and you can introduce wisdom, reflection to see whether what you're thinking needs to be said or not, when is the right time or not, and so on. Another aspect of mindfulness practice is you become aware of what you've said even afterwards. Even if at the time you spoke, you weren't that aware and it just all came out maybe too quickly or without wise consideration first, okay. But if you establish mindfulness, well, at least you remember what you said, and sometimes you learn lessons afterwards, don't you? You said something that was hurtful or caused problems. At the time you weren't mindful enough to stop yourself, but later at least you can reflect back on it by remembering what you've said, what other people said, particularly if you've had a disagreement or some problem with another person. And the Buddha said if you practice mindfulness, you'll tend to remember conversations you've had from a long time ago, things that were said from maybe many weeks ago, months ago. This is one of the values of mindfulness, is it helps you to remember things that need to be remembered, important things. So remembering teachings that you receive from others, or words of advice, or words that are very meaningful. You can remember them maybe for a whole lifetime because of mindfulness. But also you can remember your mistakes and learn from them as well. By practicing mindfulness, you can then review. So I often encourage people to review at the end of their day what they've said from the start of the day through to the end. Every conversation. If you've got enough time, just sit down sometimes, quietly review every conversation you've had and see if you can remember what you said, what other people said to you, what you said during the day. And if you practice this, you can get better at doing that, and then you become clear what you said to whom, where it was, what the context was, and then maybe reflect, was it useful or not, was it harmful or helpful? And you learn that way, because if you're doing that regularly, then before you engage in conversation, or as you're engaging in conversation, you become much more aware of what you're saying, because you know later you'll be reviewing what you've said. So you become aware as you're speaking. And it's very helpful. Say at work, if you have to engage with other people, in the family, with relationships, especially when there's difficult conversations to have with parents, with children, with other family members, can really help. It's another reason why the Buddha encouraged us not to drink or take drugs, because once you drink and take drugs, your control of your speech goes very quickly. And you might feel light-headed and enjoy, as you begin to become intoxicated, but also a lot of problems arise because you're not very mindful of speech. And, as a layman, I can't remember now, but I can remember at the time so many conversations either I held or seeing other people fall into horrible arguments, even physical altercations because they lost control of their speech, all kinds of situations where intoxicants make your self-control disappear and people have problems for it. And on it goes. So the practice of right speech, what is the result of it? Well, it means the path factors are developing in your mind. Ultimately, it's a factor that leads to nibbana. It's that important. wrong action and right action, well, same, isn't it? Right action, the intention and to refrain from killing or physically harming other creatures, even animals and insects. So when people come to offer Bindabat here in the summer, we're always reminding them to be mindful of their action, because there's a lot of flies and insects around, and it's tempting to squash the flies or the bugs. And we have to learn how to be restrained, let alone people, but even little creatures. We can practice compassion and forgiveness, even though they're annoying, and not kill them. Right action in terms of not taking what is not given. So, you may normally not come anywhere near stealing or taking what is not given, but sometimes there are smaller situations, like a very common one in the lay life is fridges, isn't it? You have a fridge and people have their food in the fridge. If you're a student or in a shared house, or even in your family sometimes, there's somebody has their favorite piece of food in the fridge, and then someone else comes along and takes it. You might say, well, we're all part of the same family or the same household, it's not really stealing. But if it hurts their feelings, you could say it is a form of taking what is not given. And there's so many subtle ways we may come towards taking what is not given. So all kinds of things like filling in tax returns, stuff to do with money and paperwork, customs declarations when we cross borders, all kinds of things that we can knowingly or unknowingly start to move towards what really becomes stealing. When you train monks, one of the things we investigate as we investigate in the rule where we are not allowed to steal is the steps that lead up to what is called theft. So if a monk was to steal something, say they were going to go into a room somewhere to steal someone's smartphone, if they were to do that, then every step they take up to the actual removal of the smartphone is a minor offence. It's not yet the offence of stealing, but it's what we call a dukkata. It's still an offence to be confessed, because maybe they take a few steps towards stealing an object from another monk or layperson, but then they change their mind and they decide, I'm not going to do it because if I steal that smartphone, it's worth a lot of money. I would be parajika, they say, which means I would have to leave the monkhood and I couldn't become a monk again in this life. But they decide not to do it. But they've still broken the rules, just those first steps or movements they took towards the stealing. It's still breaking the rules, even though they don't complete the action. So for a monk, the training in this is very refined. For a layperson, it wouldn't be necessarily stealing until you've actually moved the smartphone, say, and then hidden it or taken it away with you, perhaps. But mentally, your intention is there from the first movement towards stealing. And in this world, there's so many ways you can steal in sort of subtle ways as well, ways of manipulating things. So manipulating other people to get them to give you money. Nowadays we have all kinds of scams, phone scams, and all kinds of stuff where you're simply using wrong speech. So wrong speech, wrong action are often linked together as well, aren't they? And you're sort of just trying to deceive someone to give you money or give you power of attorney or power over their money or documents and so on. The world has become more complex, so the possibilities for wrong speech, wrong action have grown, you might say. But where does it all start? It starts with your intention. The intention to take something that is not given, fueled by greed, desire to get something for yourself. So there's plenty of food for investigation here in our daily life, to get to know our intention and to learn to be scrupulous. As a monk, you'd rather die than commit a parajika offense, rather than killing or stealing or having sexual intercourse. You'd rather die. You get to that point in your mind, you'd just rather die than do those things. As a layperson, your sila is not so refined, so you may, it's not illegal necessarily to have sexual intercourse or to kill a fly, but it would be illegal to kill or have harmful sex or to steal something of value. So you get even as a layperson, as you practice more, you become very clear on your intention, and what is a wholesome intention and what is an unwholesome intention that may lead to wrong speech, wrong action, and you steer clear of it. So with the third precept, wrong action is what we call harmful sex or sexual misconduct. So now there's a lot more discussion about this in society, sexual harassment, not just rape and violent or coercive sex, but also sexual harassment, stalking, grooming, all the other aspects of it. They all come into what you'd call sexual misconduct, and now the consequences are much more. You might lose your job, or you might be socially ostracized, or your reputation damaged. And so this bigger conversation is good, certainly for women who are often the victims of sexual misconduct. It can work both ways, of course, but I think statistically women are much more vulnerable to it. It's good that we talk more about it, there's more awareness of it. So it's not simply having sex with someone, but it's also the harmful side of it and the manipulative side of it, coercive side and harassment and so on. And where does it all start? Well, it starts with the intention. So if you're a meditator and you practice mindfulness, you're more mindful of intention, then you'll see the intention may be the thought to have sexual relations with someone that may be the beginning of an act of sexual misconduct. So say you're married or in a relationship and then you have the thought to have sex with someone outside your relationship. That's the beginning of harmful sex, cheating on your partner, say. It's quite natural to have these thoughts come up because we are all beings with lust, and that may be stimulated by just seeing someone who's attractive. But as you practice more mindfulness and you become sharper, you may give up that way of thinking and be very quick to cut it off or let it go, or not get into any behavior that's, say, flirting with someone outside of your relationship, or could be taking advantage of somebody, because we do that as well. Somebody needs your help, so you're giving your help, but you have an ulterior motive. You want to have sexual relations with them. So you're helping them, but with wanting something else from them. There's so many areas our desires, negative desires and lust can come into our behavior. So you become much more aware of that as you practice mindfulness, and you start to steer away from those ways of speaking, acting. So it will definitely come up in your practice. You become much more aware of intention as you develop the Eightfold Path. And another way that helps is to consider the consequences of wrong action, wrong speech, to help motivate you to be more restrained, more careful, more mindful. What are the consequences of cheating on your partner or cheating with someone else's partner? What are the consequences of killing? What are the consequences of stealing? And there's the internal consequences, the regret, the suspicions, the fears, the anxiety based on unskillful conduct. There's the suspicion, fears, anxiety in the minds of others, feelings of guilt, feelings of remorse, criticism. Our actions draw criticism and so on. There's many consequences that if you're interested in training your mind in the Eightfold Noble Path, you become much more aware of as you practice meditation and mindfulness on a regular basis. And as we know, what the Buddha pointed out, as all the teachers have pointed out, human beings can train themselves, they can practice, and it produces something very beautiful. So somebody who keeps the 5 precepts or 8 precepts or the rules of the monastic discipline, that person, they become beautiful in their behavior. Their speech becomes beautiful, becomes a gift to the world. And this is something we can offer to the world as human beings. Another quite a long question, so bear with me. This question has a long background, so please forgive me for the long explanation. Ajahn, you have mentioned that when you sit, you have tears running down your eyes, and I have the same thing happen to me too. And I think it started on my very first retreat with Ajahn Sundara back in 2008. During those days, on my evening pujas at Amaravati Monastery and Chithurst Monastery, I also had that experience of tears running down my cheeks. Sometimes when hearing Luang Por Sumedho chanting, my tears run. One time when I met Luang Por Biak in New Zealand, when he was teaching in Thai, though I could not understand anything at all, I just sat there with tears running down my face. Then for the past 2 years, when I picked up the practice again, whenever I sit, I almost always have tears running down every single time. But as soon as sitting finishes, the tears stop. But I don't feel sad at all during these sittings. I guess when I hear Luang Por Sumedho chant, or on some occasion when a large group of Sangha chanted, I do feel touched. Is it okay when I sit alone when this happens, but tears always come running and a runny nose, and sometimes I feel I need a lot of oxygen, so I also yawn a lot, but I'm not sleepy. And if that's in the group with others, this becomes a disturbance. I'm just wondering, how do you cope with this phenomena? Well, like everything that happens in meditation, you just take it as another object of mindfulness, establish awareness and observe. And tears and emotional states with faith or rapture that may also prompt tears. These states of mind and the physical manifestation of them, such as tears, are sankharas. They arise, they pass away. So be mindful of that, the impermanent nature of them, and also try not to attach or cling to them with desire, but just to know them as phenomena arising during your meditation. So for me, I've always had the experience of tears forming when I meditate since day one, so over 40 years ago. Sometimes a lot of tears and a lot of moisture, sometimes just a little bit, but because it's happened every time I sit meditation, and occasionally other times like chanting, I'm just used to it. So I know when I meditate, my attention turns inwards to be mindful of the body, the breath, maybe rapture and sukha arise, so there may be tears forming, but I don't make anything out of it. I just note it and carry on meditating. So it hasn't been a distraction for me or a disturbing thing, even if there's sometimes, occasionally a lot of tears, but not usually a lot of tears. But it's not a disturbance, it's just a phenomena that you note. And for me, it's usually an expression of rapture, a factor of samadhi, and as I go deeper into samadhi, it doesn't bother me and I forget all about tears and those kind of external expressions of rapture, like hairs standing on end, tingling, and other feelings in the body. They don't bother me at all, but I just note them and let them go. And I think you have to do that, whether it's runny nose, tears, sensations in the body. Sometimes it's itching, tingling sensations. Some people have particular sensations in a particular part of the body. So a very common one is here in the forehead. And sometimes that makes them tense or uncomfortable. Some people notice their heart pounding as they meditate, and that becomes a distraction. We have quite a lot of physical and mental sensations arising in meditation that we note. And the thing to do is just try and maintain mindfulness, equanimity, and let go. Don't make anything out of these things. You know, if they're a little bit time-consuming because you have to wipe away the tears or wipe your runny nose, just accept that. Have a handkerchief handy, but then move on. You know, these really are just temporary places to stop in your practice, but then to move on and not worry about them and not think too much about them. Just be mindful of them and let go. And try and develop stronger mindfulness, more continuous mindfulness, because from that you'll develop stronger states of calm, samadhi, and this will facilitate even better investigation of the Dhamma and seeing maybe the three characteristics: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and the selfless nature of physical and mental phenomena. So tears are not self. Runny noses are not self. So don't attach to them as self, because that's a delusion. They're just phenomena. Maybe it's a sign you've developed a lot of brahmaviharas, particularly around compassion. And people who have developed a lot of metta and karuna have a lot of compassion, often have tears, so they can think of their own suffering or someone else's suffering, think of somebody getting beyond their suffering who was previously suffering and then being released from suffering. These kind of reflections or meditations can bring a lot of tears. Just thinking of the suffering of beings in the world, like, you know, if you think of any group of people who are suffering more than usual, so like you might think of people in Ukraine at the moment, you know, imagine how much suffering they've got when they're not sure if they're going to be invaded. They may be able to hear the sound of bombs and guns. If you've ever been in a country where there's been a war, like there's so much anxiety when you hear the guns, you just don't know what's going to happen next. So you can feel very sorry for them. That could bring tears to your eyes. Or you may meet someone or know someone who's ill or sick and suffering with COVID or any other kind of illness. It may bring tears to your eyes if you develop a lot of compassion meditation. So these are quite normal experiences, but the thing to do is reflect mindfully. These are not self, they're impermanent, they're not self. They happen, but then you let go and don't cling to them. And if it doesn't happen, don't worry. It's not the end of the world if you don't have tears either. Some people do, some people don't. More questions? Often during or after a Dhamma talk, the nada sound seems to be extra clear and loud. I wonder why this is. Well, I assume you're talking about an internal sound that people often hear in the mind, sometimes in the vicinity of the ear as well, but sometimes it seems to just be centered in the mind as well. Or perhaps it's a sign that when you hear Dhamma, you tend to go into a more refined state of calm. Mindfulness is improved because you're listening to the Dhamma. And one of the manifestations can be awareness of the internal sound that comes when the mind is peaceful. Again, some people have this, some people don't, but it's quite common. I regularly have an awareness of an internal sound when I'm peaceful, just a kind of hiss, giving Dhamma talks, listening to Dhamma talks, meditating. Other people have the same I've talked to, and they describe the same kind of thing. Sometimes it may not be actually listening to a Dhamma talk, but just having a reflection on some aspect of Dhamma, and the mind goes inside, internally, and you're sort of still, physically still, and the mind goes inside and you hear the sound of the mind. Maybe accompanied by other factors as well, like the body may feel very light, rapturous, waves of rapture, lightness. The body may even seem to disappear. So there are these different experiences we have, but usually it's a sign of heightened awareness, more mindfulness, sometimes investigation of the Dhamma as well, especially if it's a Dhamma talk. And it can continue for a long time. So sometimes it wakes us up, and people use it as a meditation object to focus on as well. So it's probably a sign of your mind is in a more wholesome state, a better state than normal. So you could say it's a good sign. Sorry, the questions are written in pen and the light is not enough, so my fading eyes with old age, struggling a bit. So there's another question. For the similes of the 5 khandas, it is easier to understand rupa and vedana. However, for sanya, sankhara and vijnana, the similes the Buddha gave are confusing. They are, for sanya, he compared sanya to a mirage, so perception is compared with a mirage. Sankhara is compared with the plantain tree or the banana tree. And vijnana, consciousness, sense consciousness, is compared with a conjuring trick, a magic trick. Can Ajahn please explain more? Well, the Buddha, in his wisdom, peaceful mind, wise mind, very creative, using simple images, sometimes stories, but often images to help people who are trying to understand the Dhamma, understand the Dhamma better. So, spend a lot of his time teaching about the nature of the 5 khandas. You divide a human being into these 5 groups. Physical khanda is the body, the physical form made up of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire and water. Vedana khanda is the group of experience, the feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Perception, sanya is perception, very closely linked to memory, but how we remember things or how we perceive things, which will vary from person to person. Sankhara is the mental formations, intentional formations where we make karma. That's compared to the banana plant. The feelings are compared to waves or ripples on the surface of water. I think form is compared to foam on water. When you see a bunch of foam, it seems solid, but there's actually nothing there when you touch it. Ripples obviously arise and pass away like feelings do. Perceptions are compared to a mirage. So you get them on a hot day when you see the road is shining like water, or if you're in a desert, sometimes people see the shining sunlight like water, and because they're thirsty, they imagine it to be an oasis. Or there's a road on the other side of Melbourne near Mount Macedon where you drive through this road and you think you're going downhill when you're going uphill, or you think you're going uphill when you're going downhill. Distance and height can deceive us, so you get funny perceptions that are like mirages. And many other examples there are in the world, but mirages are things that are not there but you believe to be there. And perception is like that, because it's how you remember something and you add on your own input into that, depending on your attachments, what you like, what you don't like. So, you can see somebody coming towards you and mistake them for somebody else, or see someone, you can see a man as a woman or a woman as a man, or they do all these kind of experiments with perception, don't they? To help show you how easily you're fooled by the mirages of perception. And I remember somebody driving along, and they're sitting 2 people in an open air car, sports car with no roof. There's a man and what seemed like a woman with long hair sitting next to him. But it turned out the woman was actually a dog with long hair flowing in the wind. And when the dog turned, oh, it's a dog, not a woman. Perception can be deluding very easily, depending on how we remember things, how we perceive things, the details that we remember. And we pick certain details and remember them, and then we ignore others. There's a lot to investigate there, but it's like a mirage, the Buddha said. Basically, it's deluding, and it's not permanent. Perceptions change, like mirages will come and go. Perceptions come and go, they're impermanent, and they're not self, they're conditioned things, depending on the situation, and all the different causes and conditions in that situation may produce a certain perception, but that is produced by those causes and conditions, but you may believe it to be your perception. You hold on to it with a sense of self. I know. How often do we think we know something? It's true because I know it and I believe it, so it must be true. And we see that nowadays with social media, so many conspiracy theories and all kinds of beliefs and views on things and opinions about things in the world. And some of them may be based on truth, some are based on falsity. And, technology only exacerbates or exaggerates this problem of perception being like a mirage. Sankhara, mental formations, intentional formations are like a banana tree. So if you've ever cut down a banana tree or seen a banana tree being cut down, it's just made up of layers and layers of flesh, but in the middle there's no hardwood. I think this was probably used because it's in Asia particularly, people are always looking for hardwood for fire, for building, and a plantain tree or a banana tree has no hardwood, so it's like, if you were going looking for hardwood, you'd be disappointed if you cut down a banana tree hoping to build something out of it or use it for firewood, because there's nothing there. It just fizzles away, evaporates away, because the flesh of the banana tree, as soon as you cut it, it just disintegrates. What's holding it together is actually water. And as soon as you cut it, the water supply from the ground is cut off. So it just shrivels up into nothing very quickly, and you can't use it for firewood or building or anything. It's nothing. And that's like when you see mental formations the way they are. They're nothing. There's nothing there. There's no self there. There's nothing solid. So I've always thought that was a really great simile. Just like foam for the body is really good because it looks like there's something when you got a bit of foam on the water. Like here we get it on mountain streams in the monastery. You get where there's an impediment because there's a little bit of chemical and just natural different things in the water. When there's an impediment like a rock or a log, you'll get foam building up as the water rushes past. And that foam, you pick it up and there's nothing there. It's gone, it's just air. And this body that seems so strong and solid, and we say is me, mine, myself, it's just like air. One day it'll just be gone, dissolved. So mental formations are the sort of mental equivalent. There's nothing there. A thought arises and ceases, and it's gone. An intention and a mood that forms around that. You're happy, you're sad, you're angry, you're worried. There's nothing to them. They arise, they cease. They arise out of nothing and cease back into nothing. Just like a banana tree, there's nothing there. There's no solid hardwood. The last one of the khandas is the vijnana khanda, sense consciousness, so seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. The Buddha said is like a conjurer's trick, because suddenly you're seeing, suddenly your awareness is with the seeing, but then suddenly you're hearing, and sometimes you can't tell, am I hearing or am I seeing? Because it seems like it's at the same time. It's actually individual moments of consciousness. And only by developing mindfulness and investigating the Dhamma will this be revealed. Most people who never meditate, never hear the teachings of the Buddha might not even consider this fact, that your mind, your consciousness is individual, separate moments of consciousness. Seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. And then internally, your mind is throwing up thoughts and ideas, memories. And it seems almost like a conjurer's trick. Suddenly you're seeing, suddenly you're hearing, boom, boom. It's very quick, isn't it? So fast, the way it moves, the mind moves around, jumps around. And that's one of the problems when you practice meditation and mindfulness. You're struggling with these fast movements of the mind. And a lot of people assume it's random. So suddenly you have a memory come up from the past. Where did that come from? Or suddenly you're thinking something that was very pleasant, and then suddenly you're thinking with anger, or suddenly you're worried or afraid. And you're seeing and you're hearing, and that links back to your mind. And it's very fast, changing all the time. So it's almost like watching a magician's show, and they just do all these tricks, and you don't know how they did them, one after another, and it's kind of fascinating, but at the same time you can't work it out. Consciousness is a bit like that. Quite difficult to fathom, quite difficult to follow. You can't follow it, like you can't follow the movement of the hand of the magician as he does the card trick. He's probably doing something quite simple, and when they explain it, it's always a letdown because you realize how easily you were fooled. But it's often just a movement of the hand. They're getting you to put your attention over here, and while they're doing something with their hand over here, and so you're fooled and they can trick you. And consciousness is a bit like this. You're hearing, you're talking, you're tasting, and it's just jumping around, and it's quite hard to follow. So the Buddha is just trying to get us painting pictures, images, to help us understand the nature of body and mind better. What you have to do is take them away and investigate them, and you may have your own images and similes come up, and people do, and they have other ways of describing the khandas. But the Buddha's aim is simply to help you to see, giving you some clues and explanations that help you to see your own body and mind better the way it is. That they are conditioned things, they're not self, they're impermanent, they're not self, and they're dukkha. Because if you attach to something that's impermanent, you suffer as the impermanence shows itself. As feelings change, you suffer, don't they? You grasp onto your pleasurable feeling, you like it with craving, and then when you lose it again, it changes. It shows that it's not self, you suffer. So this attachment or identification with the khandas as self leads on to suffering all the time. And the biggest one, of course, is fear of death. We don't want to die, and yet these khandas are impermanent. They're not going to last forever. So there's a lot more to investigate here than I've got time for tonight, but just giving you a few pointers there. So that was the last question. So we've gone on for a long time, so maybe we'll finish there and can talk again next time.